The morning Abraham Easton rode onto Sallie Carver's property, the sun was barely cresting the red rock ridges of the New Mexico territory, and the dust his horse kicked up caught the light in a way that made it look like he was arriving wrapped in fire. Sallie had been awake since before dawn, same as every other morning since her father passed in the spring of 1874, because the horses didn't wait for grief to pass before they needed feeding. She was standing at the corral fence in her worn leather boots and her father's old canvas jacket, when she heard hoofbeats coming down the road that cut through the scrub brush and juniper trees toward the ranch. She didn't reach for the rifle leaning against the fence post right away. She assessed first, same way her father had taught her. One rider, no urgency in the pace. A man who wasn't running from something or toward trouble. She reached for the rifle anyway. He pulled his horse to a stop about 20 yards from the fence and raised one hand, palm out, the universal gesture of a man announcing he meant no harm. His hat was a dark brown slouch hat, travel-worn and honest-looking, which Sallie had learned over the years was a better indicator of a man's character than whatever words came out of his mouth first. "Morning," he called out. His voice carried well over the open land between them. Deep and measured, not the kind of voice that was trying to impress anyone. "I'm looking for the Carver Ranch. Woman in town said this might be the place." "You found it," Sallie said, keeping the rifle loose in her hands but visible. "What business do you have here?" He didn't seem offended by the rifle. Men who were offended by a woman holding a rifle on her own property weren't men she had any interest in talking to. He swung down from his horse in one clean motion and tied the reins to the fence post she'd put there for exactly that purpose, then walked toward her at an unhurried pace. He was tall, somewhere around 6 feet, with dark hair and several days' worth of stubble on a face that was neither pretty nor ugly, but was the kind of face you kept looking at because it seemed like there was something honest behind it. "My name is Abraham Easton," he said, stopping at a respectful distance. "I'm out of Santa Fe originally, though I've been ranging around the territory for the past several months. I'm in the market for horses." "The woman at the general store in Tucson said Sallie Carver raises the best cutting horses in the whole of the New Mexico territory. Said if I wanted quality animals, I'd be a fool to look anywhere else." Sallie studied him. "Mrs. Beaumont said that." "She said it with considerable conviction," Abraham said. Sallie let the rifle settle against the fence post again. She was 27 years old, which in 1874 in the New Mexico territory made her a woman who had already outlasted one husband, 2 droughts, an Apache raiding party that had taken 3 of her best mares before a treaty negotiation had settled things down, and the slow grief of watching her father fade over the course of a single terrible winter. She was not easily impressed by men, and she was not easily moved by flattery. But she knew Mrs. Beaumont did not say things like that about just anyone, and she knew her horses deserved every word of it. "Come look at what I've got," she said. Abraham followed her along the fence line toward the main corral where 8 horses stood in the early morning light. They were a striking bunch, all of them. Sallie had a gift for the work, bred into her by a father who had spent 40 years learning the art of horse breeding, and had passed everything he knew down to the only child willing to listen, which happened to be his daughter. The horses she kept were quarter horses primarily, bred for the explosive short-distance speed and the lateral agility that made them invaluable for working cattle. They were also bred for temperament, because a horse that was fast but unreliable was worse than no horse at all. Abraham Easton stopped at the fence and rested his forearms on the top rail and looked at the horses for a long time without saying anything. Sallie watched him looking at them. She could tell a lot about a man by how he looked at horses. Some men looked at them like they were furniture. Some men looked at them like they were machines. Abraham Easton looked at them like they were worth knowing. "That paint mare," he said after a while, nodding toward a striking black and white pinto near the water trough. "She moves different from the others." "That's because she is different," Sallie said. "Her name is Comet. She's got the fastest lateral cut I've ever seen on an animal this side of the Rio Grande. Ran her against 2 ranch-cutting horses last month in a friendly competition, and she made them both look like they were standing still. How old? 4 years. She's got good years ahead of her. And that big sorrel in the back, the one keeping to himself. Sallie glanced at the dark red gelding standing alone near the far end of the corral. That's Copper John. He's not antisocial. He just doesn't bother impressing anyone he hasn't decided to trust yet. Once he trusts you, there's no better horse on 4 legs. Abraham turned to look at her then, and there was a quiet amusement in his expression. Sounds like someone else I just met. Sallie held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the horses. I have 6 animals available for sale right now. The paint mare, the sorrel, 2 bays I've had in light training, and a pair of grays I picked up at auction in Albuquerque last fall that I've had working for the past 8 months. What are you looking for exactly? Ranch work, trail work, competition? A combination of all 3, Abraham said. I'm putting together a string for a cattle operation I'm setting up south of here, near the Mescalero country. I need horses that can do everything. Work cattle in the morning, cover ground in the afternoon, and still have the temperament to not throw a greenhorn rider come morning. Mescalero country, Sallie said slowly. That's rough territory right now. I know it, he said, and something in his voice suggested he had already thought hard about that fact. How many horses are you looking to buy? I'd ideally like 4 to start, maybe 5 if you've got the right ones. Sallie nodded slowly. 4 or 5 horses was a significant transaction, not just for the money, but for the fact that it would take time to evaluate each animal properly and ensure the right match. She had a code about the horses she sold. They went to people who would treat them properly, and she turned away buyers before who didn't meet that standard, even when she needed the money badly. I'll need to see how you handle them before I decide anything, she said. Abraham looked at her steadily. Fair enough. She opened the gate and handed him a lead rope. Start with Copper John, she said, since he doesn't impress anyone who hasn't earned it. What happened next was the first thing that shifted something in Sallie Carver's carefully maintained interior world. Abraham Easton walked toward the sorrel gelding with the same unhurried confidence he'd used to approach the fence, the same deliberate calm that didn't announce itself or make a show. He stopped a few feet from the horse and just stood there, not reaching out, not making any sudden movements, just letting the animal take stock of him. Copper John, who had turned away from 2 potential buyers in the past month with a clear display of his displeasure, lifted his head from the hay he'd been investigating and looked at Abraham with those large, intelligent eyes. Then he walked over to him. Sallie watched Abraham reach up slowly and lay his hand along the horse's neck, and she watched Copper John stand perfectly still under that touch, his ears rotating forward in a posture of attention rather than nervousness. Well, she said quietly, mostly to herself. Abraham glanced back at her over his shoulder, and the quiet amusement was there again. Did he pass the test, or did I? Sallie didn't answer that question, but she felt something warm move through her chest that she promptly told herself was just the morning sun beginning to climb. She spent the next 3 hours working with Abraham in the corral and in the open land behind the barn, watching him ride each of the available horses and asking him specific questions about what he felt in each animal and how each responded to his handling. He was a skilled horseman, not showy, not aggressive. He had a quality of stillness in the saddle that the horses responded to with an almost visible relief, as though they'd been waiting for a rider who wasn't constantly arguing with them. By mid-morning, Sallie had made up her mind about which horses she'd sell him, and she'd also made up her mind that she was going to invite him in for coffee, which was something she never did with buyers. Her housekeeper, a capable and warm woman named Marta Delgado who had been with the family for 12 years, had already produced a plate of corn tortillas and a pot of something that smelled like heaven. And when Sallie brought Abraham toward the house, she could see Marta watching them both from the kitchen window, with an expression of considerable interest that Sallie chose to ignore. The farmhouse kitchen was low-ceilinged and comfortable, smelling of dried herbs and wood smoke, and the good honest smell of a place that was lived in and cared for. Abraham took his hat off when he came inside, which was a small thing but not a small thing, and he sat at the table with the ease of a man who didn't make himself important but also didn't make himself small. "You've been running this place alone since your father passed?" he asked, wrapping his hands around the coffee cup Marta had pressed into them. "Marta helps, and I've got a ranch hand named Old Pete who's been here longer than I have, though he's getting up in years and his knees aren't what they were." Sallie sat across from him and poured her own coffee. "But yes, the decisions are mine. That's no small thing. This is good land, but it takes managing." "It does," she agreed simply, because it was true and it didn't require anything more elaborate than acknowledgement. "Where did you learn to breed cutting horses to that standard?" he asked. "My father, James Carver. He came out here from Kentucky in 1845 when this was still Mexican territory. Spent almost 30 years learning what these animals are capable of and what they need to be capable of it." She paused. "He also learned from the Comanche traders he dealt with in the early years. They understood horses in a way that most people raised on Eastern stables never figured out." Abraham nodded. "I've heard the same. The Comanche horsemen were the best light cavalry in the world. Any military man who fought against them in the old days will tell you that, even if it pains them to say it." Sallie looked at him carefully. "You're not bothered by the fact that my father learned from native people. Why would I be bothered by someone learning from people who know more about something than he does?" Sallie considered this. The New Mexico Territory in 1874 was a place where that kind of plain-spoken acknowledgement was not as common as it should have been. The Indian Wars were still actively reshaping the land around them, and the injustice of it was something she thought about every time she rode the boundary lines of property that had once been shared or owned by others. Her father had talked about that too, with the kind of complicated honesty that didn't make him a saint but made him a man she'd respected. "You're not what I expected when I saw you riding up," she said. "What did you expect?" "A man trying to get the best price by telling me my horses weren't as good as Mrs. Beaumont said they were." Abraham smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look younger than the weathered quality of his face suggested. "They're better than Mrs. Beaumont said they were. Copper John alone is worth twice what you'll ask for him." "Then don't be surprised when I ask accordingly," Sallie said, and she smiled back before she could decide not to. The negotiation took place over that kitchen table and then continued outside and then came back inside again, because it was the kind of negotiation that kept finding new things to discuss. Abraham was sharp with numbers, and he knew what horses were worth in the current market across the territory. And Sallie was equally sharp and equally knowledgeable. And the conversation between them had the electric quality of two people who were genuinely well matched in a specific kind of intelligence, finding each other in a setting where that intelligence was the thing being tested. By early afternoon, they had agreed on a price for 4 horses. Comet the Paint Mare, Copper John the Sorrel, and 2 of the bays whose names were Dust and Remedios. The price was fair to both of them, which was the only kind of fair that Sallie believed in. Abraham counted the payment out in good silver coin and placed it on the table between them, and Sallie counted it herself without apology and put it in the tin box in the kitchen cupboard where her father had always kept the ranch money. "I'll need a day to arrange transport," Abraham said. "I didn't ride out here planning on buying 4 horses today, so I need to make some arrangements in town. Would you be comfortable keeping them here until tomorrow morning?" "Of course," Sallie said. "I'll make sure they're ready for you at first light." He put his hat back on and extended his hand, the way you sealed a deal. Sallie shook it firmly, the way her father had taught her to shake hands, and when she felt the warmth and the steadiness of his grip she had to work a little harder to keep her expression composed. "Thank you for your time, Miss Carver," he said. "Mrs. Carver," she corrected automatically, and then immediately wished she hadn't because it opened a door she hadn't planned on opening. He paused. My apologies. No need. He passed 3 years ago. Fever. She said it matter-of-factly because that was the only way she could say it. Thomas Carver had been a decent man, younger than her, and they'd had a kind marriage if not a passionate one, and the fever had taken him in the summer of 1871 before they'd managed to have children, and life had gone forward because that was what life did. Abraham held her gaze for a moment with an expression that was careful and respectful and something else that she couldn't quite name. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, and it didn't sound like the thing people said when they didn't know what to say. It sounded like he meant it. He rode away down the road with the same long-legged, easy way he'd arrived, and Sallie stood at the fence watching him go for longer than she could entirely account for. Well, said Marta from directly behind her, with the particular emphasis that Marta reserved for important observations. Don't, said Sallie. I said one word. It was a very loud word. Marta laughed and went back inside, and Sallie turned back to her horses and tried to get on with the afternoon's work and mostly succeeded. Abraham did not return at first light the next morning. He returned the afternoon before, around the hour when the sun was starting its descent, and the light went golden and generous over the hills. He tied 2 extra horses to the fence, animals he'd borrowed from the livery stable in Tucson Wells to carry the leads for Comet and the others, and he came to the door of the house to let her know he'd arrived early and hoped it wasn't an inconvenience. It was not an inconvenience. Marta made more coffee. He ended up staying for supper. This was not something Sallie had planned, and she noticed herself making peace with the fact that it was happening anyway. The conversation at supper ranged across subjects that surprised her. He had some education, more than you'd expect from the roughness of his travel-worn appearance. He'd read things. He held opinions on those things, but held them with a quality of openness that meant he was willing to be wrong, which in Sallie's experience was the most reliable indicator of actual intelligence. He told her about the cattle operation he was setting up south of Tucson Wells, near a stretch of land called Red Bluff that he'd been working to acquire through legal channels over the past year. He'd saved for the land over 12 years of working other men's ranches, starting from when he was 19 years old, and had nothing but a strong back and a stubborn streak. He was 32 now, he told her, and he'd finally purchased the land deed 6 months ago and was in the process of establishing the operation properly. It's a good piece of land, he said. Good water access, decent grass, sheltered from the worst of the winter wind by the bluff itself. But getting a cattle operation running from nothing is slow work. You have to do it in the right order or you end up with half an enterprise that collapses before it stands. You sound like my father talking about breeding horses, Sallie said. Good things that last tend to require the same kind of patience, regardless of what they are, he said. Old Pete had joined them at the table because that was how things worked on the Carver ranch. Pete was 63 and had the face of a man who had seen the full range of what the West could offer, from the beautiful to the brutal, and he regarded Abraham with the kind of assessing squint that Sallie trusted completely. You served? Pete asked in the direct way he had. Army of the Potomac, Abraham said. 63 through 65. Infantry. Pete nodded. He'd been a scout for the Union Army himself, before his knees, and a particularly bad winter had brought him to New Mexico. Something in that nod communicated a species of understanding that didn't need words. What brought you from Virginia to New Mexico territory? Sallie asked. Everywhere I looked in Virginia after the war was somewhere I'd watched someone die, Abraham said, without any particular drama in his voice. Just fact. I needed a place that didn't have that. New Mexico had the advantage of being the farthest west I could get before I ran out of land. Sallie was quiet for a moment. She understood the desire for a place that could be new in a way that an old place couldn't be. Her father had talked about that exact feeling when he described why he'd come west in the first place. The supper ended and Abraham stood and thanked Marta with genuine appreciation that made her beam, and he thanked Sallie for the hospitality and said he'd come back in the morning to collect the horses rather than trying to move them in the dark. "You're welcome to use the barn," Sallie said, and then stopped herself because she hadn't planned to say that either. He looked at her carefully. "I appreciate that, but I arranged to stay at the boarding house in town. I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing. It's a long ride back to town and the horses you borrowed for the lead lines will be tired. It makes more practical sense." All of that was true. She was fairly sure it was also not the whole reason she'd said it. "Then I'm grateful," Abraham said. He slept in the barn and was up before her the next morning, which was saying something, and she found him already at the corral, checking over each horse with the careful attention of a man who understood that what he was taking on was a responsibility as much as a purchase. He'd brought good brushes from his saddlebags, and he was working through Comet's mane with the kind of patience that the paint mare rewarded with an almost comical show of contentment. "You know she's going to expect that every morning now," Sallie said from the gate, holding 2 cups of coffee. He turned and smiled. In the early morning light, she could see the gray beginning at his temples, just the barest touch of it, and the lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting against sun and wind. And she thought that he was not conventionally handsome, but that he was the kind of person your eyes wanted to keep finding in a room, or in a corral, or anywhere else. She handed him the coffee and they drank it leaning against the fence in the long quiet of a New Mexico morning, with the birds starting up in the scrub and the sky going from pearl to gold, and the horses moving peacefully in the space between them. "I have a question," he said eventually. "Go ahead." "Would you be open to me coming back, not to buy more horses?" He paused. "Or maybe to buy more horses, but not only that." Sallie looked at the horizon for a moment. "You're asking if you can court me," she said, because she preferred directness to the long route around things. "Yes," he said, "that's what I'm asking." She looked at him then. He was looking back at her with an expression that was steady and honest, and that held underneath it something that she recognized because she'd felt the echo of it in herself over the past 2 days. Not infatuation, which was too quick and too shallow for what she meant. Something more considered, something that had been paying attention. "The ranch needs managing," she said. "I can't be distracted from that." "I'm not asking you to be distracted from anything," he said. "I'm asking if I can come back." She thought about it for what was genuinely a reasonable amount of time, and then she said, "All right, come back." He nodded, and the smile that followed was quiet and good, and then he went back to working Comet's mane with the brush. He came back 3 weeks later. The 3 weeks between that morning and his return were not idle weeks for Sallie. She worked the horses, managed the ranch accounts, dealt with a fence line in the north pasture that had been damaged by a late spring flood, and occasionally found herself looking at the road that came through the scrub brush and the juniper trees, and then looking away again with a deliberate redirect of attention. He came back on a Tuesday, which she would remember later, because it seemed like an unremarkable day for a remarkable thing to begin more properly. He arrived at mid-afternoon with a burlap sack that contained 3 things: a bag of coffee beans from a particular trader in Santa Fe, who apparently sourced them directly from Veracruz, a book of poetry by Walt Whitman that he'd found at a general store in Albuquerque and thought she might enjoy, and a very small carved wooden horse that he'd made himself over the evenings of the past 3 weeks, sitting by the fire at his camp near Red Bluff. The wooden horse was the thing that undid her just a little, because it was Comet. He'd carved the paint markings into it with a small knife, all the asymmetric patches of black and white in the right places, and he'd gotten the angle of the head right, that particular proud tilt that Comet had when she was feeling particularly pleased with herself. Sallie held it in both hands and looked at it for a longer time than she meant to. "You made this," she said. "It's not fine art," he said. "But I wanted something to bring you, and the coffee seemed insufficient on its own." "The coffee is wonderful," she said. "This is more than wonderful." She put the little horse on the kitchen windowsill where it would catch the light, and she made coffee, and they sat at the table and talked for the rest of the afternoon and into the early evening. And this time, the conversation moved into more personal territory than it had before. He asked about her life on the ranch, not in the way that people asked out of politeness, but in the way that people asked because they genuinely wanted to understand. She told him about learning to ride before she could reliably walk, about her father's patient and demanding teaching, about the way the territory had changed in her lifetime and was still changing, and not always for the better. She told him about the Apache raid in 1872 that had taken 3 of her mares, and about the complicated months that followed as the military and the tribal leaders negotiated, and the land simmered with the kind of tension that felt like a held breath. She'd lost the mares, but she'd also lost a kind of simple certainty about the world that she had once had, the sense that if you worked hard enough and were honest enough, the land would simply let you exist on it without cost. The raid had reminded her that other people had prior claims to this land, and that the violence of contested ownership wasn't clean or simple on any side of it. Abraham listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "Did you get the mares back?" 2 of them. The treaty negotiations included the return of livestock. The third one, the gray mare I called Silver, she was never found. I think she died. She paused. Or maybe she ran. I hope she ran. That's a generous thing to hope. It's a practical thing to hope is what it is. Dead is finished. Running means possibility. He looked at her with that quality of attention that she was beginning to associate specifically with him, the way he gave his whole focus to whatever was in front of him. "That's a good philosophy," he said. She looked down at her coffee cup. "What made you decide to settle here?" she asked. "You've been all over the territory, from what you say. You could have bought land anywhere." "Red Bluff has water," he said, "and it has sky in every direction. And I think there might be something else near it that has potential." He said this last part in a tone that was careful and deliberate, and she understood without needing him to be less oblique that he was talking about more than cattle. She looked up and met his eyes. "Don't be in too much of a hurry," she said softly. "I'm the furthest thing from being in a hurry," he said. "I just want you to know that I'm here for reasons that go beyond the horses, and I think you deserve the honesty of that." She nodded slowly. "I do appreciate the honesty." He came back 2 weeks after that, and then 2 weeks after that, and the pattern of his visits settled into a rhythm that began to feel necessary rather than optional. He always came with something, not always a gift in the formal sense, but always something that showed he'd been thinking about her in the time between. Once it was a repair to the broken fence gate that he'd noticed on his last visit, and had spent the morning fixing before she was awake enough to tell him. He didn't need to. Once it was a packet of seeds for a particular variety of pepper that Marta had mentioned in passing that she couldn't find in the local stores. Once it was nothing more than a long, clear afternoon, and his full attention, and the kind of conversation that left her feeling understood in a way she hadn't felt in a very long time. He met Pete properly, and the 2 men developed the particular wordless regard that men who have both survived hard things sometimes build between each other. Pete told Sallie, in his direct way, that Abraham Easton was good people. Coming from Pete, who had not offered that assessment of a man since her father, this meant a great deal. Marta's opinion had been formed even earlier and was expressed with slightly more enthusiasm. "He looks at you like you matter," she told Sallie one morning, with the particular certainty of a woman who had lived enough years to know the difference between a man who was looking at you and a man who was seeing you. The summer moved through July and into August, and with each visit something between them grew incrementally more certain, the way a plant in good soil grows, not dramatically, not overnight, but with a conviction that was hard to argue with. They took to riding together in the evenings when he visited, out along the boundary of the ranch where the land opened up to wider views, and the cooling evening air came down from the mountains, and the world felt large and generous. One particular evening in late August they rode to the top of the low ridge that formed the northern boundary of the property, where you could see in every direction for miles, the scrubland falling away in browns and greens and golds toward the far blue haze of the mountain ranges on the horizon. They stopped there and let the horses stand, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that has weight and warmth in it. "I keep thinking," Abraham said slowly, looking out at the view, "about how different this is from Virginia. In Virginia, everything was close together: trees, houses, people, history. Here, everything is spread out like it has room to breathe. Do you miss it?" "Virginia, parts of it," he said. "The green, the way rain smelled there, some of the people." He paused. "But I don't miss feeling like every piece of ground had already decided what it was. Here things are still deciding." Sallie looked at the land she'd grown up on, the land she'd inherited and maintained and built upon. "My father used to say that the territory was the best place in the world for people who needed a second chance. Did you need one?" She thought about it honestly, because he deserved honest answers. "I think I needed a first chance at something that wasn't already decided for me," she said. "My father treated me like I had abilities worth developing. My husband was a good man, but he had ideas about what a wife's life should look like that didn't entirely match what I needed my life to look like." She paused. "After he passed, I felt terrible grief, and also, underneath it, something that I'm still not entirely proud of feeling, which was the sense that I could finally do things exactly as I needed to do them." Abraham was quiet for a moment. "I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of in that feeling," he said carefully. "Most people would disagree. Most people aren't you living your life." He turned to look at her. "What you've built here on your own terms, it's remarkable. Not because you're a woman doing it, though that is remarkable in its own right in this time and place, but because you're a person who knew what they were capable of and didn't let the world talk them out of it." Something in Sally's chest did a complicated thing. She held his gaze in the fading golden light and thought about the fact that she had not been looked at like this in a very long time, perhaps ever, with this particular quality of recognition. "Abraham," she said. "Yes. I think I might be in considerable trouble where you're concerned." He looked at her steadily, and the quiet smile came. "Good," he said softly. "Because I've been in considerable trouble where you're concerned since Copper John walked over to me on the first morning." She laughed, a genuine laugh that surprised her with its ease, and the sound of it seemed to please him enormously. When they rode back down to the ranch in the dark, their horses moving comfortably side by side in the moonlight, his hand found hers just briefly, a touch so light and careful that she might have imagined it, except for the warmth that spread from it through her whole arm and settled somewhere in the region of her heart. She did not imagine it. September brought the first cooling of the air and a change in the quality of the light that Sallie loved, that particular sharp clarity that came over the New Mexico territory as summer eased, and the sky went a deeper and more serious shade of blue. It also brought a complication. Her brother-in-law, a man named Gerald Carver, who was her late husband Thomas's younger brother, arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday morning without notice or invitation. Gerald was 30 years old and had the particular quality of confident unpleasantness that sometimes comes with being a man who has been told he is important without having done much to earn the designation. He had been in Tucson and had apparently decided that his late brother's ranch and the horses on it were worth investigating more closely, particularly now that word had apparently gotten around that the Carver Ranch was producing and selling exceptional stock. He came with a hired lawyer named Fowler, which told Sallie everything she needed to know about the nature of the visit before either man had said a word beyond their names. "Thomas left no will," Gerald said, sitting at the table where Abraham had sat so many times now, in the chair that had come to feel like it belonged to Abraham. Gerald sat in it differently, with his elbows spread wide and a quality of assumed ownership in his posture, which means the estate is subject to territorial law as it regards property. I've spoken to Fowler here about what that means." Fowler produced a paper and began explaining the relevant laws in a tone designed to be intimidating, which Sallie recognized and refused to be affected by. My husband and I homesteaded this property jointly, she said, when Fowler paused for breath. The deed is in both names. His passing transferred his portion to me as surviving spouse. This is not complicated. The horses are a separate matter, Gerald said. Thomas contributed to the purchase of the original breeding stock. Thomas contributed to the purchase of 3 mares in 1869. Those mares are no longer on this property. Everything currently here is stock that I have bred, trained, and developed over the course of 5 years using my own labor, my own knowledge, and the operating profits of this ranch. Gerald leaned back. Nevertheless, Fowler believes there's a case to be made. Sallie looked at Fowler, who had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Does he? What followed was an uncomfortable and aggravating 2 days. Gerald stayed, having invited himself to the guest room with a sense of entitlement that made both Marta and Pete visibly hostile, and he spent those 2 days making observations about the ranch that were designed to sound like concern, while actually being a form of assessment for value. He commented on the horses. He commented on the quality of the fencing. He made a point of mentioning, more than once, the prices that good cutting horses were currently fetching at auction. Sallie dealt with this with the composure of a woman who had learned that losing her temper cost her more than it cost anyone else, while internally she felt the hot particular fury of someone watching a lazy hand reach for something it had no right to. Abraham arrived on the 3rd day. He hadn't known about Gerald. He arrived the way he always arrived, with that unhurried quality, and found Sallie at the corral fence with her jaw set in a line that even he could read from a distance. He tied his horse and came to stand beside her and said, quietly, "What's happened?" she told him in plain terms. He listened without interrupting and without the false expressions of outrage that some men performed when they wanted to seem helpful while actually making a situation about themselves. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Have you talked to a lawyer?" "There's only one in Tucson Wells, and he works primarily with the mining operations. I've sent a letter to Albuquerque." "How long will a response take?" 10 days at best. Abraham nodded slowly. "Then for now, what do you need?" It was the exact right question. Not what are you going to do or what should we do or let me handle this. What do you need? "I need Gerald to go home," she said. "And I need to know that what I've built here is actually mine. The legal part will get sorted out when it gets sorted out, and from what you're describing it sounds like it will be sorted in your favor. The deed situation is as you described it, and the livestock records will show what you've bred and when." He paused. "As for Gerald, would it help if he met me?" Sallie looked at him with a slight narrowing of her eyes. "What exactly do you mean by that?" "I mean that sometimes a man changes his assessment of a situation when he understands what the situation actually is," Abraham said, with a quality of mildness that she was beginning to understand was not mildness at all but a particular kind of steadiness. "And what is the situation as you see it?" He held her gaze for a long, steady moment. "The situation, as I see it, is that this ranch and everything on it belongs to you, and that you are not alone in that fact." She felt something move through her that she could no longer pretend was just the morning sun or a good cup of coffee. She looked back at the corral. "All right," she said. "Come meet Gerald." Gerald's response to Abraham was predictable. He expanded, the way small men do when they encounter someone who represents a challenge to their assumed position. He was visibly calculating, visibly reassessing, and then visibly deciding on a strategy of polite condescension. "Easton," he said after the introduction, "you bought horses here recently." "I did," Abraham said pleasantly. "4 excellent animals. They've already improved my operation considerably." "And you have a ranch of your own, near Red Bluff." "I do. Bought the land deed last spring. We're building the herd now." Gerald glanced between Abraham and Sallie with an expression that was meant to be inscrutable and wasn't quite. "You have a personal interest in the situation here then, beyond just being a buyer." "I have a personal interest in Mrs. Carver's well-being, yes," Abraham said, "as I suspect most people who know her do." "And what kind of personal interest is that specifically?" Abraham looked at him steadily. "The kind that's serious," he said, and the kind that means I'll be paying close attention to how this particular situation resolves. It wasn't a threat. It was something more effective than a threat, which was a clear statement of presence and intention from a man who obviously meant what he said. Gerald processed this, and something in his posture shifted fractionally. Fowler, who turned out to be more pragmatic than his employer when he had time to reconsider, pulled Gerald aside that evening and apparently explained some things to him about the actual legal merits of the situation and the costs associated with pursuing a case that was likely to go badly. The following morning, Gerald announced that he would be returning to Tucson. He said something about family feeling that was clearly not genuine, but allowed him to frame his retreat in terms that preserved some of his dignity. And Sallie let him have that because getting him off the property was more important than making any further point. When Gerald's wagon disappeared down the road, Pete made a sound of deep satisfaction and went back to work with the air of a man who has seen justice done. Marta produced a celebration in the form of fresh bread and stewed peppers, and Abraham stood at the fence with Sallie and watched the dust settle after Gerald's departure and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. "Thank you," Sallie said eventually. "I didn't do anything. You'd have handled it exactly as well without me there." "Probably," she said, "but it was good to have you there." He turned to look at her, and in the daylight his eyes were a warm dark brown that she had been thinking about in the quiet moments between his visits more often than was probably wise. "Sallie," he said, "yes. I don't want to keep riding out here every 2 weeks. I want to come here more often than that." He paused. "Or I want a reason to stop needing to make the ride, if you understand what I mean." Her heart was doing something emphatic. "I think I understand what you mean," she said carefully. "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it properly when the time is right. I don't want to rush you, and I don't want to make assumptions. But I also think you should know that my intention is serious. It has been serious since the first morning." Sallie looked at the man standing beside her, this man who had arrived to buy horses and who had stayed in her thoughts for every day since, who carved wooden horses by firelight, who asked what she needed instead of telling her what he was going to do, who looked at Copper John and got Copper John's approval, which was not easily granted, who had looked at her property and her work and her life with respect rather than with the particular measuring gaze that some men turned on things they wanted to acquire. "Abraham," she said. "Yes, ask me now." He was quiet for just a moment, and then he turned to face her fully. "Sallie, I came here to buy horses, and I have ended up in a situation that is significantly more than I expected and that I am entirely grateful for. I am asking you if you are willing, if you would consider making this permanent, the coming back and forth, making it one place instead of two." She looked at him for a long time, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to be fully present for this moment, to give it the weight it deserved, because she understood that the things you rushed past were the things you regretted having rushed. "Yes," she said, "I'll consider it, more than consider it." He took her hand in both of his, the way he had that first time on the horse, careful and warm and deliberate, and looked at her with an expression that was so openly full of something that it made her breath catch. "Good," he said softly. The engagement was made formal not with a ring, which Abraham explained apologetically he had not yet acquired, but with a particular direct conversation in Sallie's kitchen with both Pete and Marta present as the closest thing either of them had to family witnesses. Abraham spoke plainly about his intentions and his situation, the land he owned, the cattle operation in its early stages, the honest accounting of what he had and what he was working toward. He also made clear that he understood, entirely and without reservation, that the Carver ranch was Sallie's, and that any future they built together would be built around that fact and not over it. Pete listened and nodded. Marta wept briefly, and then immediately began planning the wedding with an organizational energy that was both impressive and slightly terrifying. The ring came 3 weeks later, on his next visit. He'd ridden to Albuquerque specifically to find a proper jeweler, because Tucson Wells had limited options for that kind of purchase. It was a simple ring, silver set with a small turquoise stone the color of the New Mexico sky, and when he opened the small box and offered it to her across the kitchen table, she felt her throat tighten in a way she hadn't expected. "It's the color of this place," he said quietly. "This specific sky. I thought it should be." She let him put it on her finger, and then she looked at him across the table with the ring on her hand, and the morning light coming through the window, where the little carved wooden horse still stood, and she thought about all the roads that had to be the particular road they were before two people could end up in the same kitchen at the same moment, and the weight of that improbability was almost too much to hold all at once. "Come here," she said. He came around the table to her, and she put her hands on either side of his face and looked at him for just a moment, really looked at him, and then she kissed him for the first time, properly, with intention and feeling and the full weight of everything that had been building since the morning the dust from his horse had caught the sunrise light. He kissed her back in kind. Marta, who had come to the doorway to ask about the coffee and witnessed this development, retreated with a smile the size of the whole territory and went to make the coffee with great enthusiasm. They married in November, before the winter came and made travel difficult. The ceremony was held at the ranch, outside in the open air the way both of them wanted, under a sky that was the exact color of the stone in Sallie's ring. The minister from Tucson Wells came out, a mild and genuine man named Reverend Hart who had known Sallie's father and who spoke about the couple with a warmth that felt earned rather than performed. Pete stood with Abraham. Marta stood with Sallie. There were perhaps 20 people in attendance, neighbors from the surrounding ranches, Mrs. Beaumont from the general store who had apparently decided she deserved some credit for the match, a few of the traders and ranchers from town who Sallie had built relationships with over the years. Sallie wore a dress that had been her mother's, altered by Marta's skilled hands to fit her properly, and updated with a piece of blue ribbon at the collar that happened to match the turquoise in her ring. She carried wild desert sage and dried autumn flowers because it was November, and that was what the land offered, and she thought it was more honest and more beautiful than a formal arrangement would have been. Abraham, cleaned up and wearing a good jacket that he'd clearly acquired for the occasion, stood at the front with Pete and watched her walk toward him across the open ground of the ranch, with an expression on his face that was so completely without pretense or performance that several of the guests were visibly moved by it. He was not a man who did things in half measures. The ceremony was simple and direct, the way both of them preferred things, and when Reverend Hart said the words that made it official and Abraham took her hands and looked at her, she felt the particular quality of a thing becoming exactly what it was meant to be. The same feeling she sometimes had when a difficult horse finally found its trust and gave it over freely. "I think," she told him quietly, while the guests milled around with the food Marta had organized, "that you are quite possibly the best horse buyer I have ever done business with." He laughed, the good laugh that she had come to love for how freely it came. "I think you are quite possibly the best negotiator I have ever encountered. You got me to pay exactly what the horses were worth and also to come back and keep coming back until I'd committed entirely more than I planned." "I didn't plan it," she said. "Neither did I," he said. "That's what makes it perfect." He pulled her into a brief embrace, and she let herself lean against him for just a moment, feeling the solidity of him, the realness of this man who had ridden in on a dusty morning to look at horses, and had instead become the thing she hadn't known she was missing until he was there. The winter that year was moderate, which was a mercy. Abraham divided his time between Red Bluff, where his hired man and the growing cattle herd required regular attention, and the Carver Ranch, where he had begun to take on an increasing share of the physical work alongside Pete. They had talked at length about the logistics of maintaining two operations, and had reached a practical arrangement that acknowledged both the ranch's established nature and the cattle operation's important future potential. The plan was to eventually integrate the two properties economically, if not geographically, with the horse breeding continuing to supply not just outside buyers, but their own growing cattle enterprises remuda. It was a good plan because both of them had built it and both of them understood every part of it. The first winter of their marriage had a quality that Sallie had not expected, which was ease. She had expected adjustment, the kind of friction that comes when two people who have lived independently for years have to learn the rhythms of sharing space. There was some of that naturally. He had habits that she found initially inexplicable, and she had habits that clearly puzzled him. He had a particular way of leaving his boots in exactly the wrong place that she mentioned 3 times before he managed to change. She had a habit of starting conversations in the middle of thoughts she'd been having silently, which he adjusted to with impressive speed. But the ease was the primary quality. The sense of rightness that she felt when she woke in the morning and heard him already moving around the kitchen or the barn, or when they sat together by the fire in the evenings with their respective reading, and the comfortable quiet between them, had the texture of something that had always been this way rather than something new. She told Marta this one morning, and Marta, who had been married for 24 years to a good man who had passed 6 years prior, said simply, "That is what it is supposed to feel like." And then, because Marta was also practical, "Are you expecting?" Sallie looked up from the pot of coffee she'd been pouring. "I don't know yet," she said. "Maybe." Marta smiled with the composed certainty of a woman who already knew the answer to the question she'd just asked. By February it was confirmed. Sallie told Abraham on a Sunday evening when they were sitting by the fire, and she told him in the plain, direct way she told him everything, looking at him steadily with a quality of watchfulness, because she wanted to see his actual response rather than giving him time to compose one. His actual response was to sit entirely still for approximately 3 seconds, and then to reach across and take both her hands in his with a grip that was very careful and very warm, and to look at her with an expression that held wonder and joy and a seriousness that told her he understood the full weight of what she'd said. "Are you well?" he said first, which was exactly the right first thing. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Strong as I've ever been, actually." "Good," he exhaled slowly. "Good." He looked down at their joined hands and then back up at her. "A child." "That would appear to be the plan," she said gently. He laughed, the surprised, honest laugh, and then he pulled her carefully toward him and held her with such deliberate tenderness that she felt the warmth of it settle into every part of her. "I'm going to be a father," he said into her hair, with a quality of quiet astonishment. "You are," she said. "Try to be ready by September or so." The pregnancy progressed well through the spring. Sallie refused to be made an invalid of it, continuing her horsework and ranch management with modifications where necessary. And Abraham supported this absolutely, while also being the kind of quietly attentive presence that meant she always had what she needed without being treated as though she was fragile. He read everything he could find about the practical aspects of what she was going through, which in 1875 was not a great deal, and consulted with the nearest doctor, who was in Albuquerque by letter. A midwife named Dolores Reyes, who was known throughout the region as the best there was at her work, came to the ranch in March to meet Sallie and assess the situation, and the two women developed an immediate mutual regard based on the fact that they were both people who preferred to be direct and competent over being polite and vague. The spring also brought progress on the cattle operation. Abraham rode south to Red Bluff every 2 weeks or so, and on some of these trips Sallie rode with him, because she wanted to see the land that was going to be an important part of their future. The first time she saw Red Bluff properly, the way the red sandstone rose from the desert floor in long, irregular formations that caught the light and held it, she understood why he'd been willing to work 12 years for this particular piece of land. "It's beautiful," she said, looking at it from horseback in the long afternoon light. "The cattle don't care about beautiful," he said, from beside her on Copper John, who had become clearly Abraham's particular horse over the course of the winter. "But you do," she said. He was quiet for a moment, "Yes," he said simply, "I do." She looked at him in the light that was turning everything red and gold, and she thought about how completely this man had woven himself into the fabric of her life in the space of less than a year, and how it didn't feel constraining or compromising the way she had sometimes feared another marriage might. It felt like the opposite, like having more of herself to be. Old Pete's knees gave him serious trouble in the spring, and Abraham took on more of the physical work at the ranch without being asked, and without making any kind of performance about it. He and Pete had developed a relationship that had moved from mutual assessment to genuine friendship, and on the evenings when Pete's pain wasn't too bad, they would sit on the porch after supper and talk in the particular shorthand of men who had both seen war and who understood each other's silences as thoroughly as their words. Pete told Sallie, one morning when Abraham had ridden out to check the north fence, that he had not seen anything like this man since her father. She understood this to be the highest assessment Pete had in his vocabulary and received it accordingly. The summer of 1875 was hot and productive and full. Sallie's belly grew, and she adjusted to its changes with the practical grace of a woman who trusted her own body, and Abraham watched over her with a care that was never overbearing, because he knew her well enough by now to know exactly where the line was between supportive and smothering. The horses moved through their training cycles. New buyers came. 2 ranchers from the Texas side of the territory came together to purchase 3 animals and left with effusive praise that spread through the regional network of cattle operations. The Carver horses developed a reputation that grew steadily. Abraham also made progress with the cattle. A herd of 40 head of good Texas Longhorn stock arrived in June, managed by the hired man he'd had working Red Bluff all winter, a capable young Mexican cowboy named Tomás who could work cattle from horseback as well as anyone Sallie had ever seen. Tomás was 22 and had been with Abraham since the start, one of the first people Abraham had trusted, and his loyalty was returned absolutely. In late August, Sallie was sitting on the porch in the long evening cool when Abraham came out and sat beside her and put his arm around her very carefully, the way he'd learned to do as her body had changed, finding the angle that was comfortable for both of them. "Ready?" he said. For which part? All of it. She considered the question honestly. The birth was weeks away and she was not afraid of it, though she was respectful of it. The ranch was in the best shape it had ever been. Her marriage was something she had not known to hope for but was grateful for every single day. The future had a shape to it that felt solid. "Yes," she said, "I think I am." The baby arrived in September on a morning when the air had just turned its first corner toward autumn. Dollar's Rays was there, efficient and calm, and Abraham was in the kitchen with Pete because Dollar's had been firm about the limits of how many people could be in the room, and he had spent the morning in the kitchen making coffee that nobody drank and pacing the distance between the stove and the door approximately 80 times. The sound that came from the bedroom was a healthy, indignant, serious cry. Pete looked at Abraham across the kitchen table. Abraham looked back. Marta appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later with her face bright with tears. "A boy," she said. "Sallie is well. They are both well." Abraham was through the doorway before Marta finished the sentence. The boy was sturdy and dark-haired and looked at Abraham when he first held him with an expression of considerable skepticism that reminded Abraham, with a flood of feeling that nearly undid him, of the way Copper John had assessed him on the first morning. "He's looking at me like he's not sure I deserve this," Abraham said. Sallie, tired and radiant from the bed where she was propped against every pillow they owned, said, "Give him time. He'll decide in your favor." Abraham looked at the baby in his arms and then at his wife, and the feeling in his chest was so large that it had no words adequate to it. He settled for what he had said before, because it was still the truest thing. Good. They named him James, for Sallie's father. James Easton arrived in the world with an emphatic opinion about everything and a set of lungs that could be heard from the corral. He was 3 months old when he made his first trip to the stables, carried by his father with the same careful, deliberate attention that Abraham brought to everything that mattered. He regarded the horses from that height with enormous eyes, and Comet, who was usually indifferent to human visitors, stretched her nose out and sniffed at the small person with a delicacy that Sallie watched with a feeling she could not quite name, but that was something close to joy being too large for the container of the moment. "She likes him," Abraham said with quiet satisfaction. "She has good taste," Sallie said. Pete recovered enough from his knee trouble to take on lighter duties in the spring of 1876 and declared himself the primary educator of young James in all matters of ranch life and horse management, a role he took completely seriously and that James seemed to find entirely satisfying. The two of them had an alliance that Sallie found both amusing and deeply moving, the old man who had known her father and the new child who bore her father's name. Abraham and Sallie celebrated their first anniversary in November with a quiet supper, the two of them and Marta and Pete and baby James, which was exactly what both of them wanted. Abraham had written a letter, which he read to her at the table, that was a plain, honest accounting of the year and what it had meant to him, and Sallie sat listening to it with her chin in her hand and felt that the world, which was often complicated and frequently unjust and always demanding, had also given her this, and that this was extraordinary. She had written him something too, which she read after him, and it said in part, "I have learned that the bravest thing I have ever done was not managing this ranch after my father passed, or getting through the years between then and now, though those things required courage. The bravest thing was to open the gate when you knocked, not just the gate to the corral but the one I'd been keeping shut inside myself, because opening it meant trusting that the world could give me something good without taking it away." He reached across the table and took her hand and didn't say anything because the silence was the right response. The following year brought new developments and deepened roots. The cattle operation at Red Bluff grew steadily, and Tomás, who had proven himself indispensable, was given a proper stake in the operation rather than just a wage, because Abraham believed that the people who built something with you deserved to share in what they'd built. Tomás, who had not expected this, expressed his gratitude in the form of extreme dedication that translated into the herd nearly doubling over 18 months. The horse breeding operation expanded. Sallie took on a young woman named Clara Reyes, who was Doller's niece and who had grown up around animals and had the gift for it, as an apprentice in the horse training work. Clara was 19 and eager, and had the right quality of patience that the work required, and Sallie taught her the way her father had taught her, with rigor and respect, and the understanding that what they were doing was worth doing well. She also took on 2 additional mares for the breeding program, one a striking Appaloosa from a breeder in Colorado, and one a gray quarter horse from the eastern part of the territory, that had exactly the bloodlines she'd been looking for to improve the speed profile of the next generation of cutting horses. The decisions she made about the breeding program were careful and deliberate and scientifically minded in the way that good stockmanship always was, and they reflected the accumulated knowledge of a woman who had been learning her craft for her entire life. In the spring of 1877, Sallie told Abraham that she was expecting again. He received this news with the same wholehearted wonder he had brought to the first announcement, though this time he had more confidence in his practical response, and the first words out of his mouth after the initial stunned silence were sensible and caring in equal measure. "Dollars," he said. "Already written too," Sallie said. "Good." He exhaled and took her hands. "Good." He looked at her with a warmth that she had not gotten tired of, not in 2.5 years, not even close. The warmth was the same quality it had always been, but it had layers to it now, built up like sediment, everything they had been through together adding to its depth. "I love you," he said, because it was the truest available thing. "I love you," she said back, because it was equally true from her direction. The second baby arrived in the autumn of 1877. Another healthy child, this one a girl, which sent Pete into an entirely uncharacteristic display of emotion that he then pretended had not occurred. Abraham held his daughter with the same careful reverence he'd shown his son, and looked at Sallie over the small, sleeping head with an expression that was complicated and deep, and that she understood completely. They named the girl Me, which had been Abraham's mother's name, and which he had offered tentatively, and she had accepted immediately because it was a good name, and because she understood what it meant to him to give it. Easton proved to be a considerably quieter presence than her brother, which Marta said was already a quality that would serve her well in life. She observed the world from a position of watchful calm that was recognizable as something she'd inherited from her father. James was running by this point, with the confident disregard for obstacles that small boys develop almost from the moment they achieve forward motion, and Me watched him from whatever spot she'd been set down in with an expression of composed assessment. "She reminds me of someone," Abraham said one morning, watching the children from across the kitchen. Sallie looked at him. "I was going to say the same thing about you," she said. The year continued to build. The ranch was thriving. Red Bluff was producing. The horse breeding operation had developed a reputation that extended beyond the territory. A letter arrived from a rancher in California asking about the possibility of purchasing several of the Carver horses for a large operation he was developing near Sacramento, and Sallie wrote back with prices and conditions that were fair and firm, and the rancher accepted without negotiation, which she found satisfying. One spring afternoon in 1878, Sallie was working with a young horse in the round pen when she looked up and saw Abraham walking toward her from the house with James toddling beside him, holding his father's hand with the proprietary firmness of small children everywhere. Abraham had James on one side and Copper John on a lead line on the other, because Pete had asked if Abraham could take the old sorrel out for some light exercise, as Pete's knees had been particularly bad that week. The picture of the three of them, man and child and horse, moving across the open ground of the ranch in the afternoon light, stopped her working entirely. She stood in the round pen with the young horse nosing at her shoulder and watched them come, and felt something so complete move through her that she had to breathe through it. Abraham saw her watching and raised a hand in greeting, and James, following his father's cue, raised his own small hand in the same gesture. Copper John, for his part, walked alongside with the particular air of a horse who knows he is being well handled and approves of it. Sallie raised her own hand back. Later after supper, after the children were in their beds and Pete had said his good nights and Marta had gone to her room, Abraham and Sallie sat on the porch in the dark the way they often did, with the stars over the New Mexico territory filling the sky from horizon to horizon in the extravagant way that only this kind of open land allowed. "I've been thinking," Abraham said. "You think loudly when you're working something through," she said. "I can hear it from across the corral." He smiled, and in the dark she felt more than saw it. "I've been thinking about Pete," he said, "about what we should do to make sure he's properly cared for as he gets older. He's been here his whole working life." This was not what she'd expected him to say, but it was entirely characteristic, and it made her love for him surge fresh. "I've been thinking the same thing," she said. "I thought we could make it official. Not wages, we've been paying him wages. A proper arrangement that makes him secure." "I was thinking he should have the South Guest cottage," Sallie said. "Properly his, titled to him. It's small, but it's good, and it would mean he had something of his own that nobody could take from him." Abraham nodded. "That's better than what I was thinking." "I usually am," she said mildly. He reached over and found her hand in the dark and held it loosely, the way they often sat in the evenings, their fingers interlaced without any particular reason beyond the fact of each other's presence. "Sallie," he said. "Yes." "Are you happy?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The land around her was dark and quiet and large. The same land her father had come west for 40 years ago. The same land she'd grown up on and loved and fought for and worked. The house behind them held 2 sleeping children and the traces of a full and productive day. The man beside her was the man she had opened a gate for and then been entirely glad she'd done it. "Yes," she said, thoroughly and without qualification. "Good," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. She leaned her head against his shoulder and they sat like that in the big dark under the enormous sky, and the peace of it was the kind of peace that you only find when you have built something real and you know it. They told Pete about the cottage arrangement the following morning, and Pete, who was not a man who showed much, sat very still for a moment with his jaw working and then said, "You didn't need to do that." "No," Sallie agreed. "We didn't need to do it. We wanted to do it." Pete looked at Abraham and then at Sallie, and then he nodded once, very definitively, and stood and went back to work. And Sallie saw, from the way his back was held as he walked out, that he was moved in a way he would not have wanted witnessed directly. Clara had become a fully capable trainer by this point, and had developed her own relationship with the horses, and the work that was distinct from Sallie's but equally real. She had also developed a quiet and apparently mutual interest in Tamaz, who rode up from Red Bluff on an increasing frequency that had nothing to do with business requirements. And Sallie and Abraham watched this development with the composed amusement of people who understood exactly what was happening, and had the wisdom to say nothing about it that might hasten or hinder its natural course. In the late spring of 1879, Tamaz rode up on a Tuesday and asked to speak with Abraham, which Sallie interpreted correctly and went to find unnecessary tasks in the barn, and whatever conversation occurred between the 2 men in the kitchen resulted in Tamaz emerging with a look on his face that was the particular combination of relief and terror that belongs to men who have just made an important decision official. Clara and Tamaz married in the summer of 1879, on the same patch of open ground where Sallie and Abraham had married 5 years before, and Dolores Reyes, who was Clara's aunt, stood beside her the way Marta had stood beside Sallie, and Pete stood with Tamaz the way he had stood with nobody before, because both Abraham and Sallie had told Tamaz separately that Pete should be the one. It was a good day. An extraordinarily good day, the kind that the desert West could produce with its particular quality of light and sky, and Sallie stood beside Abraham during the ceremony and felt his hand find hers without looking, and felt the specific warmth of a life that was layered with good things, each year adding to what had come before. James, who was 4 years old and had views about everything, announced during the celebration supper that he intended to have horses when he grew up, specifically Comet's descendants, a declaration that received the enthusiastic endorsement of everyone present. Me, who was 2 and had recently discovered that she had opinions she wished to express, contributed several remarks in a language that was mostly her own invention but clearly forceful. Marta translated these as approval, which the group accepted. By 1880, the Carver Ranch and the Red Bluff cattle operation had grown into an integrated enterprise that was known throughout the territory. Buyers came from Colorado and Texas and California. The horses that bore the Carver breeding continued to excel in cutting competitions and in the hard practical work of a Western cattle operation, and their reputation was the direct result of the methods Sallie had developed and continued to refine. Abraham had built a reputation of his own for honest dealing and for a quality of management that treated the people who worked for him with fairness and respect. In a territory where that was not always the standard, it distinguished him in ways that mattered. They continued to run the operations as the partnership they had always been, every major decision made between them, each bringing different knowledge to the table, and each respecting what the other brought. It was not without friction, because 2 intelligent and capable people will always have disagreements, but it was friction of the productive kind, the kind that sharpens rather than damages. Pete's health gradually declined as the years moved through the early 80s, and Sallie and Abraham ensured that he had everything he needed in his cottage, and that his days had meaning and company. He continued to tell James stories with a dedication that suggested he had decided this was his primary purpose in the world, and James listened with the absorbed attention of a child who understood without being told that what he was receiving was something worth receiving. When Pete passed in the spring of 1883, it was quietly and in his own bed in his own cottage, with Sallie sitting beside him and Abraham standing at the door and James, who was 7, holding the old man's hand with a gravity that made everyone in the room understand that this child knew what mattered. They buried Pete on the ranch, on the rise of ground north of the barn where you could see the mountains, because that was the view he had loved best. The ceremony was small and honest, which was exactly what Pete would have wanted, and Reverend Hart, who had now known this family for almost a decade, spoke about a life well lived with the conviction of someone who had watched it being lived and could testify to that fact. Sallie planted desert sage on the grave, because it was what the land offered, and because Pete had always said it was the smell of the territory, and the territory was the best place he'd ever been. Life moved on, as it does, with the specific texture of a life that has grief in it but is not defined by grief. James grew into a boy who was his grandfather's student in spirit, and his mother's student in practice and his father's student in character, which was as good a combination as any child could have. Me grew into a girl who was watchful and precise, and had her father's quality of stillness and her mother's quality of directness, and who at 5 years old could already tell you more about what a particular horse was feeling than most adults could. In 1884, a third child arrived. Sallie had believed they were done, or possibly believed she had believed this, and the discovery at 37 that she was expecting again was greeted with a complicated initial reaction that resolved fairly quickly into a welcome clarity. Abraham, when she told him, sat at the kitchen table for a full moment and then said, "Does this feel right to you?" "Yes," she said after thinking about it honestly. "It does." "Then it's right," he said simply and reached for her hand. The third child was a boy, born in the early months of 1885, and they named him Thomas, which was the name of her first husband and which felt like the right thing, a way of acknowledging everything that had come before and understanding that it was part of what had led to everything now. Thomas Easton was a sunny and easy child who seemed to find the world a thoroughly acceptable place and greeted each day with an equanimity that made everyone around him calm down slightly. He and me formed an immediate alliance of the kind that younger and older siblings sometimes form, and James, who was 10 when Thomas arrived, received his younger brother with the magnanimous condescension of a firstborn who has had time to decide that sharing attention is acceptable. Sallie watched her family grow and change and fill the space of the ranch with its specific ordinary, extraordinary life, and she thought sometimes about the morning that Abraham had ridden up on a dusty road with his hat and his quiet voice and his intention to buy horses. She thought about how easily it could have gone differently. He could have bought the horses quickly and left. She could have been more closed than she was. The world could have arranged itself in any number of other configurations. But it hadn't. He had stayed long enough to earn Copper John's trust and then hers, and she had let him, and everything that followed had followed from that. One evening in the summer of 1885, after supper, when Thomas was asleep and James was in his room, and me was sitting on the porch with a book, Sallie and Abraham were doing the particular comfortable domesticity of ending the day together in the kitchen, and she looked at him across the room, this man she had now known for 11 years, and felt the love for him with a freshness that still surprised her. He looked up and caught her looking. "What?" he said, with the smile that was entirely his own. "I was thinking," she said, "about horses." "Were you?" "Specifically about how you came here to buy some and you paid a very fair price for 4 good animals and then you stayed and stayed and it cost you considerably more than the silver you left on the table." He came across the kitchen to her, unhurried, the way he did everything, and stood close enough that she could see the gray at his temples that was fully gray now and the lines around his eyes that were deeper, and that she thought made his face better rather than otherwise. "It cost me my heart," he said, without any negotiation of the price whatsoever. "I should have warned you up front," she said, reaching up to touch his face the way she had on their wedding day with both hands, looking at him squarely. "That's poor business practice. Best transaction I ever made," he said, "and I went in entirely unprepared. Next time," she said, "you should read the terms before you agree to them." "What are the terms?" She looked at him, this man who had carved her a wooden horse by firelight and fixed a broken fence gate before she was awake to stop him, and stood in a kitchen telling a difficult man that she was not alone, and meant it absolutely, and held their children as though each one was the most extraordinary thing he'd ever been trusted with. This man who had given her his whole serious, honest self without reservation, and who looked at her still, after 11 years, like she was worth looking at. "The terms," she said, "are that this is the rest of your life and mine together, exactly as it has been." He held her face in his hands with the same careful warmth he always had and looked at her with everything that was in him, all of it, the whole full life. "Those," he said quietly, "are terms I agreed to the morning Copper John walked over to me." She smiled, and he smiled, and the summer night came in through the open door of the kitchen where they had made all their most important decisions, and outside the horses moved in the corral in the warm dark, and the 3 children of Abraham Easton and Sallie Carver slept under the New Mexico sky. And the ranch that had been her father's and then hers, and then theirs spread itself out across the good honest land in the full content quiet of a life that had been built well, and was exactly what it was supposed to be. The ring on her finger was still the color of this specific sky. The little wooden horse still stood on the kitchen windowsill. And Copper John, old now and gray at his muzzle but still carrying his head with that particular proud dignity, stood in the corral with Comet's granddaughter beside him, and the night was quiet and full, and it was, as it had been becoming for 11 years, enough. More than enough. Everything.